Welcome back to Black News Tonight. One of the most infamous prisons in the country is, without a doubt, Rikers Island. Many caged in the slow death New York facility are at the moment protesting the inhumane conditions there. According to the New York Times, about 200 incarcerated people in one of the 8 buildings of the island prison are refusing to eat correction department meals in protest of unhygienic conditions, lack of safety, extremely cold weather, and the fast spread of COVID-19, with at least 370 positive cases. Joining me now is Dr. Joy James. She's the Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College, and Jerome Wright. He is the statewide organizer for Halt Solitary Campaign. That is a humane alternative to long-term confinement. I want to thank you both for joining me this evening. Jerome, let's start with what the current situation on the ground is like. What's happening right now?
What's happening is we have a human rights crisis right now on Rikers Island. We have people dying almost daily. We have people who are not eating because they're resorting to this as a last-ditch effort to draw attention to the deplorable conditions, the unsafe conditions, and all the things that, listen, we're talking about people who have not been convicted of a crime, and they're being treated worse than people who have been sentenced in upstate prisons. It is a staffing problem. They don't get their medicine. There's no mental health. Solitary confinement in defiance of the halt solitary laws being used. Programming needs are not being met. COVID, as you say, is running rampant and is not abating in any stretch of the imagination, and can only get worse if things continue the way they are. It is a harrowing experience to be on there, and right now it's almost a death sentence.
Almost a death sentence. Professor, this is happening right as Eric Adams becomes the new mayor of New York City, himself a former police officer. And there's a way that he has talked about incarceration. Certainly he's talked about reform, but he seems somewhat comfortable, in my estimation, with the existence of solitary confinement, with punishment as the primary mechanism for dealing with harm. What does it mean at this moment to have black man, black mayor, former police officer dealing with what is a carceral crisis?
Now, that's a really important question. We look for leadership by trying or wanting to see ourselves right in these official capacities, like representing government, state power, et cetera, et cetera. But as Mr. Wright pointed out, I mean, our humanity is the source of power, right? So caring about people who are literally living under conditions that are in violation of human rights and civil rights codes, right? And I would also say that, the leadership is in the 200 people on strike. It's not coming from the mayor's office, right? Because there's a certain callousness that's coming from, this sort of bureaucracy, and also this allegiance to not just policing, but also to punishment, to say that solitary confinement, which is understood by most people who are informed as being a source of not just torture, but also increased mental illness, negative health outcomes once you're released, right? All the data is there in terms of caring about people, caring about our communities, and caring about our cities. But this performance of indifference, power, sort of like, bring the fist down, and somehow the chaos and the torture in Rikers is going to diminish or dissipate is totally irrational.
Wow. Jerome, when we think about that chaos, that torture, we've seen a long tradition of incarcerated folk resisting those conditions, whether it's solitary, whether it's food. We've seen it happen through lots of means, whether it's through the criminal legal system. They file cases. Sometimes there are hunger strikes. Sometimes there are other acts of resistance. Do you feel confident that this particular tactic, this particular strategy of a hunger strike will be effective for its goal, particularly given how much the state is sort of indifferent to whether incarcerated folk live or die?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm going to tell you affirmatively, I think it will. It's by the fact that I'm being interviewed right now to discuss this, that it has gotten some national and statewide attention. That's what they don't like. See, the Department of Corrections, the Bureau of Corrections, they like to do things under the cloak of darkness and like nobody know. But when the world finds out, then they have to comport themselves like the humans they're supposed to be in the beginning. So I really think that, listen, I've been on a hunger strike before. I've been incarcerated. I've been in solitary. And when you resort to starving yourself for attention, you're letting people know that you're willing to die to get things changed. And I don't think they want any more deaths on their hand than they already have this year. Last year, 16 deaths. So yes, it is bringing attention to it. And the other thing that you may not know, and I only know because I was locked up, is that there's a lot of paperwork involved when people refuse to eat. They are drowning in mounds of paperwork now. They will end this and do what they need to do just so they don't have to do the paperwork.
Professor James, why is this even still a struggle? As Mr. Wright is talking and laying out sort of tactically why this makes sense, there's still a question of the structural conditions. There's still a question of why horribly inhumane conditions are not just common, but somewhat normalized. When we hear people are starving in prison, we hear people are suffering from deplorable conditions in prisons, there are many people who don't bat an eye. What is it about this nation? What is it about this moment, this society that allows that to be normal?
I think it's moral decay. I mean, we'd like to blame everything on Donald Trump, right? And so we can say, you know, he put everything on steroids in terms of going downhill. But if you think about Lani Guinier, I know Bell Hooks transitioned recently, but also Lani Guinier, the Harvard law prof who wrote Tyranny of the Majority, right? So this is supposed to be a functioning democracy. It is maladaptive. I mean, it doesn't conform to human rights or civil rights. And it's become part of normalizing the culture to be this indifferent. And, you know, if we thought about it, if we're only white people were in power and it was all white guards or white, you know, jail union that was meting out this type of abuse disproportionately against Black people, we would register emotionally, psychologically, politically to the antebellum era. Like, however you want to define slavery in the 13th Amendment, you're treating people as animals. You're treating people worse than animals. No animals should be treated this way. You know, the waste, the, you know, rotten food, the feces on the floor, the intimidation, the humiliation, the, you know, literal terror because they're held captive. So we can do better, but our bureaucracies won't unless we force them to.
Unless we force them to. What we're seeing right now is the force. We're seeing the disciplined and principled resistance to a death-dealing system. What's happening on Rikers Island is an important moment in our political history. It's one that we're going to continue to follow here on Black News Tonight every single chance we get, because this is crucial. Joy, Jerome, thank you both so much for joining me on Black News Tonight.